So thank you again for coming today. The presentation that will take about 90 minutes. And the idea behind this presentation was to really think about Victoria as a woman. I know that we think about her as a monarch and we think about her as a historical figure, obviously, but I didn't really want to do that. I really wanted to think about her as a person. So if we get to the first slide, I'll explain what I mean. Now, if you go across England, you're going to see lots of these statues. In fact, the statue on the left is one from the town where I live, which is in the north of England. It's about 20, 30 miles outside Liverpool, where I was born. And these statues are all over England, and they're standard representations of Victoria. You can see her. She's in her regal clothes. She's got her crown. She's got her orb and her scepter. And again, when you look at that statue, you're supposed to think of her, you know, she represents order, she represents stability. And I sort of thought to myself, well, was the real Victoria like this? Was this what she actually was? Is she actually like the woman in the statue? So what I want to get to is my point that in doing this presentation, I really wanted to think of her as a person and get away from this idea of Victorian politics or the Victorian Empire or Victorian urbanization and change, but to think of her as a person. So it really is focused on the little things, not the big things that she did in her life, but the small things. And even though they don't really matter in terms of her as a monarch, I do think they help us to better understand her as a person. So without that being said, I will go to my first slide, and my second slide. So here are some sort of more interesting representations of Victoria. Obviously, the one on the right is, again, pretty standard propaganda. This is how she liked herself to be seen, similar to how we see her in the statues. But I kind of like the images on the left and in the middle. I mean, the one on the left, she's knitting. She was a big knitter. She actually donated scarves to a local army barracks. She and her daughter knitted. And the image in the middle is rather touching. She, obviously, as she grew older into the 1890s, she will develop cataracts, actually, and she refuses to have surgery. And so she insists on wearing glasses, but of course for her photographs, she didn't really like to be photographed with glasses on, but here we see her, she's trying to read. And so we get a different side of this woman, not this sort of regal, powerful figure, but a woman who's really trying to deal with her own frailties and trying to come to terms with them. So before we get into Victoria proper and her story, I just need to sort of do a little bit of a backstory with Victoria. So what you've got here is you've got the family tree. And Victoria is interesting for several reasons, not least because she's a woman and not least because she's going to rule for a long period of time. But if you look carefully at that tree, what's interesting about her is that she was never really expected to be monarch in the first place. She never expected to be in that position. And if you look at it, you can see that she is the daughter of the fourth son, the fifth child, but the fourth son. In fact, just to back up a second, her grandfather was the last member of her immediate ancestors who'd been a monarch. Neither of her parents was a king or queen. Her grandfather, George III, we know him from the American colonies, and he had 15, I didn't say that incorrectly, he had 15 children. And of the 15 children, you're thinking, well, you know, 15 children would produce a lot of grandchildren. Well, they produced some grandchildren, but unfortunately for George III, most of those grandchildren were illegitimate. There are, in fact, only two legitimate grandchildren. One is Victoria. She's the younger of the two. She's going to be born in 1819. And the other one is Charlotte. You can see her over on the left. She is born in 1817. She's going to die in childbirth. which essentially leaves Victoria as the only legitimate grandchild of George III. Next slide, please.
Oh, before we go to the next slide, let's check in with Conrad and see if there are any
questions or comments.
Any questions in the chat box? Any hands that want to be unmuted?
I mean, that's
we do not have anything as of yet, but please feel free to raise your hand or leave a question in the chat, and we will make sure Andrew gets it answered.
Thank you, Conrad. Yeah, Rita, you were good to stop me there because this does get confusing. We have lots of Georges and other names that repeat themselves, and it's very easy to get confused as to whom we're talking about. So over on the left, we can see our George III. He is the last member of Victoria's immediate ancestors who was a monarch, her grandfather, and he's the one with the 15 children. In the middle is his eldest male heir, who will be George IV. He is considered to be one of the wicked uncles. Victoria will later call him one of the wicked uncles because he leads a pretty unhealthy life. He has relationships with lots of women, but he never actually marries until much later in life. And he's known for his drunkenness, his debauchery, and his spending ways. And over on the far right, we can see that child that he had towards the end of his life. I mean, literally towards the end of his life, he will marry. His daughter, Charlotte, is born, but then she will die. That sort of leaves the way open for Victoria to become the heir presumptive. So, yes, next slide, please.
Let's check in with Conrad. Any questions, Conrad?
No, I do not see anybody's hands raised.
Okay, let's keep going.
Okay, so maybe we'll keep going and then you give a shout if there are any.
I will absolutely do so.
Okay, so when George IV dies, we get William IV, who is going to be the third son of George III, and he doesn't have any legitimate issue. He actually is in a long-term relationship with an Irish actress, and he fathers certainly somewhere in the region of around 10 illegitimate children. But of course, under the rules of the British monarchy, none of those children can be counted in the line of succession. He will also marry and try to produce a legitimate heir. And if he had have produced that legitimate heir, then that legitimate heir would have taken precedence over Victoria in terms of the succession. But at this point in his life, he's also older. Of course, he doesn't produce that child. And so then we look at Victoria's father, who is the fourth son, fifth child of the George III, Prince Edward. And I met some dear friends recently who have connections to Prince Edward Island in Canada. And in fact, Prince Edward Island, if there are any Canadians out there, is named after this Prince Edward. He's going to be the father of Victoria. And he is going to die shortly after Victoria is born. So she never really has a relationship with him. She's essentially raised by her mother, which brings up all kinds of other issues. And so let's talk about one other thing I want to get to before we get into Victoria's story proper, is two issues of one's called hemophilia and the porphyria. Hemophilia is what we refer to as what was referred to then in the 19th century as the English sickness. And it's basically an inheritable disease, which essentially means that children who inherit that can potentially, their blood doesn't clot. And so they can bleed out if they sustain an injury. And this particular problem is something that we see in Victoria's family. In her children, one son is going to die from it, Leopold. He's going to suffer a very bad fall. He's going to have internal bleeding, and he's going to die as a result of that bleeding. And the other one, the more famous one, of course, we know, if you've been studying Russian history, you'll know about Alexei Romanov, who is the son of the last Tsar of Russia, and he doesn't die from hemophilia, but we know that he had hemophilia. Because of that hemophilia, all kinds of other people come into their world, which sort of add to their problems. As far as we know, and both the bloodline of Victoria, the English ancestors, as well as her German ancestors, and also when we talk about Albert and his bloodlines, there's no evidence of this hemophilia gene ever being in either families. So then the question is, well, how is it that Victoria's children, grandchildren, and indeed great-grandchildren, in the case of Alexei Romanov, how did they get this, how did they inherit hemophilia? Well, the best answer I can give you, which isn't really a particularly good answer, but the best answer I can give you is that there is a 1 in 25,000 chance of a spontaneous mutation. Apparently, as much as I can discern, this seems to happen in older women, and Victoria's mother was older when Victoria was born. And so it's quite possible, though, that this came in through her, but through this spontaneous mutation. Now, the second thing I want to get to is the, yes, I should mention as well that perhaps not during Victoria's lifetime, but there was some speculation that Victoria's mother, that the gene could have come in, that she was not the daughter of her father, the fourth son, fifth child of George III, but that she slept with somebody else in order to produce a child, and that perhaps the gene came in that way, but quite possible. But I think not, partly because when I get to the second piece, which is the porphyria, essentially she has many of the physical features of her English royal ancestors, which leads me nicely into porphyria. Porphyria is also an inheritable disease, and essentially it leads to madness. And any of you who know anything about George III, other than he was the king at the time of the 13 colonies, will also know that George III went mad. And we believe that he had porphyria. And in fact, during Victoria's lifetime, any mention of the madness of her grandfather was banned. I mean, Victoria was extremely sensitive about any discussion of the topic. And it's also believed that Victoria's father suffered from symptoms of it too. And its symptoms seem to revolve around some form of rheumatism, and there's light sensitivity. People who have porphyria have some light sensitivity. Albert, Victoria's husband, was always very careful not to bring up the issue of this with her, and he feared that any discussion of porphyria would bring on what he called this hereditary malady. And in fact, we see a little piece of that maybe in March 1861. Victoria's mother will die, and I'll get more into the relationship between Victoria and Victoria's mother. It essentially wasn't a good relationship for all kinds of reasons I'll get to in a moment, but Victoria's reaction was excessive. I mean, she essentially had a mini breakdown which went on for several months, which, given the fact that she didn't have a good relationship with her mother in the first place, was surprising, obviously, to everybody. And so, next slide, please. Yep. So let's just very quickly just look at the timeline of Albert and Victoria. They're both born the same year. And Victoria, in fact, has a half sister. Her mother, Victoria's mother, was married before. And obviously her second husband was Victoria's father. And they marry in order to produce that heir. We talked about that, you know, George III had all those children, but no legitimate grandchildren. So there's sort of this race on to produce a legitimate heir. So she remarries. And Albert is also going to be born in the same year. They are first cousins. Victoria's mother and Albert's father are siblings. And so, they obviously knew each other before they'd even met. So 1820, shortly after Victoria's birth, Victoria's father's going to die. And in 1826, Albert's mother is divorced from her father. She led a fairly scandalous life in Germany. And Albert's father essentially kicked her out. And at this point, we're not even sure that Albert even saw his mother that much. So the point I want to get to, and I'll talk a little bit more about Victoria in a second, is that both of them have very unhappy childhoods. And what they tried to do, particularly Albert, I mean, Albert's childhood was particularly depressing. What they tried to do, Albert especially, is to create some stability and create a sense of a loving home for those children, because both of them, and again, especially Albert, lacked that when they grew up. So when Albert's around 16, 17, he's going to be invited to England. Remember, he's a first cousin. He's invited, but he wasn't just invited as a first cousin. He's also invited because it's suspected that, he could be a potential match for Victoria. And indeed, next slide, please. Obviously, that relationship is going to flourish. And shortly after she turns 18, Victoria is going to be queen. Now, before I get into Victoria becoming queen, I just want to talk very briefly about Victoria's childhood. So obviously, her father died. She's raised by her mother. She's going to be raised in Kensington Palace, which is in West London. And essentially, because she's the only legitimate heir out of all of those 15 children, the only legitimate grandchild of George III, she is put under rather strict and rather excessive rules, because there's always fear that something might happen to her, she could die. So one example of these, what we'll call the Kensington Rules, because this is where she lived in West London, the Kensington Palace, when she walked up a stair, she was only allowed to put one foot on a step at a time. Both feet had to be on the same step before she could put the foot on the next step. Another piece of these so-called Kensington Rules was her diet. Her mother went to great lengths to control Victoria's diet. And as you'll see later on in this presentation, Victoria is a woman who loves food, and any attempt to control her diet, not because the mother feared that Victoria would choke to death, but Victoria's mother was trying to control her weight. And Victoria is somebody who deeply resents anybody attempting to exercise control over her. So when she becomes queen, of course, now she can, head her own household, and she can start to run things in the way that she would want. And so on June 20th, 1837, a couple of weeks after she turns 18, if her uncle, one of those wicked uncles, William IV, if he had died before she turned 18, then her mother would have acted as regent for her until Victoria attained her 18th birthday. But she did reach 18 with a couple of weeks to spare. She now becomes queen, and her mother now has to toe the line. Next slide, please.
Sure, and Conrad was going to jump in.
Andrew, we have a couple questions.
Oh, great. Okay, sure.
The first one from Eugene. What family name were Victoria and her parents? Were they Windsors?
No, this is going to be called the House of Hanover. When she marries Albert, it's going to change to Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And then, as some of you will know, in 1917, the name will change again, because now that we've fast forwarded to the First World War, all things German are bad. Saxe-Coburg-Gotha is obviously not English. And so the royal family engages in some PR work, and essentially they drop the name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha and adopt a very English name, Windsor. It's also, not surprisingly, one of their favorite places to live, Windsor Castle. And so, we get that name change from Hanover, the House of Hanover, which is where George III and his his ancestors came from, to Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, to Windsor.
And Linda has a question as well. Where did Albert come from?
He comes from Thuringia, and there's a little town. No, sorry, Saxony. He comes from. No, he's from Saxony. He is Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and there's a little town called Coburg in Saxony, which is a beautiful little town, and it's well worth a visit if you ever go to that part of Germany. You can still see the house where he lived, the little ducal palace, and it's got the cutest little town. And I can tell you there's also a great farmer's market. I can't remember what day it was on, but a lot of fun just walking around the little farmer's market. And in the middle of the square where the farmer's market is, there's this wonderful statue of Albert, which was probably commissioned and paid for by Victoria.
Very good. Continue.
Thank you. So moving forward, so Victoria becomes queen in 1837, and something that came up in another presentation that, and I'll just address it now quickly. When the old monarch dies, you immediately become the new monarch, and as the new monarch, you assume all the powers of a monarch. A coronation will happen, and oftentimes there's going to be a time lag for all kinds of obvious reasons. Coronations are usually scheduled in the summer because the weather's better, because it's easier to travel. And so Victoria's coronation will take place probably till a year later, but she doesn't have any fewer powers because she's not being crowned. She has the same powers or rights or prerogatives that she would have had. But this coronation is just a carryover of this medieval tradition that monarchs were crowned and that they received their power from God. And so coronation is something that just reinforces that. The slide, if you look at the chair on the top left, top right, I just put this in there because I love this is the actual throne that English monarchs use when they are crowned. And for a long time, not in my lifetime, but a long time, when you go to Westminster Abbey, you could apparently climb all over it. You could sit in it because it sat right in the Abbey and anybody could see it. And I don't know if you can see it clearly, but people even graffitied it. Oh. When you go to Westminster Abbey, you can still see it. Obviously, they don't let you go anywhere near the coronation chair, but it's nothing particularly fancy. I believe it dates back from the 14th century, so it is at least 600 years old. So it's extremely significant and important to the English. And you can also notice that some of the finials have been broken off. It's just a really interesting object. If you ever do go to Westminster Abbey, be sure to get a good look at it and take some pictures. Also underneath it used to be the Stone of Scone, which is very symbolically important to the Scots. It's apparently a stone that Jacob used, that slept on, and then it was always put underneath the throne. But now I believe it's back in Scotland. Anyway, I digress. So 1838, Victoria is going to be crowned. We're going to have 400,000 people outside to see it, which, if you know the area around Westminster Abbey, they're pretty narrow streets. So imagining getting 400,000 people in to see her, but sure enough, they showed up. And then in 1839, Victoria is going to be proposed. She's going to get married. A little twist here, and probably some of you are not surprised to hear me say this, but she proposes to him. In early 19th century England, men proposed to women, but Victoria is a queen. And as a queen, she outranks Albert, who will not get the title king when he marries, because kings outrank queens. He will be a prince, and then later a prince consort. But she gets to propose to him. I mean, obviously, this was all staged beforehand, and all the different groups, her people and his people, talked. So that, she already knew what the answer was going to be. But they will get married. They'll get married at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. And interestingly as well, we get an assassination attempt later in the year, but also at the end of 1840, her first child will be born, Vicky. We'll talk more about her later on. And then Albert's father's going to die. Now, I believe the next slide, when we get to it,
we do have a question.
Yeah, okay, sure.
From Kate. Did Victoria have any childhood or adolescent playmates or friends?
I don't believe that she did. No, that's a great question. No, I mean, essentially, she was kept with her mother. I'm sure there were children who were brought in to sort of amuse her or entertain her, but she essentially lived with her mother. She had another Baroness Lazen who sort of worked with her and sort of helped her. But she essentially was living with her mother. And so her early childhood was not a particularly happy one. Great question. So what we've got here is, there is a wonderful English historian. Her name is Lucy Worsley. And what she attempted to do here before we hit play is sort of recreate what Victoria's wedding would have looked like. And so I'm just going to play a very, very short 2-minute clip just so you can get a feel for Victoria's wedding. Okay, so Rita, if you want to hit play.
Everybody here has become a cog in this new machine, the royal wedding machine that will steamroller its way through the next couple of centuries. What's happening here will change the way that life is lived in this world, the world of 1840, but it will also affect the future, the millions of white weddings to come.
It's a great aesthetic decision, this, because Victoria is clad in pristine, virginal white. You know, there's nothing clean and white in London in 1840. That dress must really have burned itself onto the retina.
It's much more than just a wedding of two young people. It is scene one of a great drama, which is going to be the unfolding of modern constitutional monarchy.
Victoria enters to music chosen for its message. Handel's A Virtuous Wife shall soften fortune's frowns.
The moment everyone has waited for, the Queen makes her entrance. This is what the experiment is all about. Sitting here in the middle of it, I can't help but be swept up in enthusiasm for the little Queen, for the romance, for the monarchy itself. This is perhaps the only flaw in the brilliant plan. The Queen's train is a bit too short for so many bridesmaids, and they're treading on each other's heels. The chapel is so narrow, everyone is near enough to hear the rustle of all that satin.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here to
Even though we're recreating all of this, I'm getting an insight into how the royal magic works.
to join together this man.
Something else made obvious by reconstructing the wedding. The Queen has placed her mother just out of her eye line, but can easily catch the adoring glances of her dear friend Baroness Lazen. In the corner, the Queen's favourite painter is making sketches for the wedding picture that will take 2 years to finish.
Okay, I'm going to just pause that there because I believe we've got another question.
Yes, we do, Andrew. From Pat, did Victoria have any education?
No, she was educated at home. And essentially, it wasn't a formal academic education. She would have learned English, French, she would have learned German. She's a fluent German speaker. She would have had some drawing, painting, music, but not a formal academic education that, say, would have prepared her for like a university enrollment. Okay, next slide. Great question. So the only other thing I just want to mention briefly is the great exhibition is going to take place 10 years later. It's a great success for Albert. Another thing I really want to get to, two things, is Albert's going to be granted the title Prince Consort. Now, why have I mentioned this? Well, at this point, her eldest son, Albert, who's also called Albert Bertie, he will soon be assuming the title Prince of Wales, which will mean that he will outrank his father. Now, you're thinking, well, why does that matter? Well, every week in England, in the Church of England, there are what are called the prayers of the people. And the Queen is always prayed for first, obviously, and then her husband. But unless she gives him this sort of bump in his title, an increase in his status, her son, Bertie, will outrank the father. So Victoria, always mindful of her status and other people's status, does not want her son to outrank his father. So she comes up with this title, Prince Consort. We're going to see this later on next week when she gives herself a little bump up in status and becomes the Empress of India, so that she does not get outranked by another of her children, Vicky, who will be the Empress of Germany. So I want to mention that. And the other thing briefly, but we'll get to this at the end, is that obviously the 1861, after about 20 years of marriage, Albert's going to die at Windsor as a result of typhoid, but I will go over that much later. But just want to sort of set the scene for you. So that's sort of the time frame that we're working in.
Ed has a follow-up question.
Sure.
So Victoria has no public policy education.
She has no public policy education, correct. But she's an extremely intelligent woman. And something that we'll talk about is that Albert does have a formal education and is also intelligent too. And he really advises her about the role of being a monarch, because we think of monarchs as we think of the pomp of the circumstance and the outfits and the crowns and the ceremony. But actually, Victoria is a head of state. And in one sense, she's the head of the executive branch. And England doesn't quite think of itself as having branches. But if we think of England as having branches of government, she's the head of it. Now, she doesn't exercise the powers that a president would exercise, because those are exercised for her by her ministers, including her prime minister. But there's a role that she has to play. She has to read important government documents every week. She is expected to be advised by her ministers. She's expected to have a brief. She's expected to keep on top of what government is doing, so that when she talks to her ministers, she can sound informed, and not only just sound informed, but be informed, so that she understands that what they're doing, that whatever role they're following, whatever outcomes they've decided on, in her mind at least, she can feel confident that her government is acting and behaving in a useful and productive manner. Now, essentially, if a government decides, if her prime minister decides to go in one direction and the monarch wants to go in another direction, well, of course, the prime minister is the one who will ultimately decide what direction policy takes. But Albert's important here because he advises her. You know, there are stories of Victoria at dinner, and she might have a government minister with her. And Albert will feed her questions in German, okay? And she will ask the minister in English, you know, so that he is helping her keep on top of this role as being a monarch. Great question.
Leslie has a question as well.
Go ahead.
Why is Bertie such a common name for royals?
I don't know. That's a great question. Well, I mean, Albert is named Albert, but Bertie's named after his father. And then, of course, we're going to get later on the current Queen's father, George VI, is also called Bertie. And Edward VIII is also called Alberti. So we have this problem when we did the Wallace Simpson and Edward VIII, because we're dealing with all these Georges and Berties and the Alberts. Yeah, I mean, they're following on from this Albert here. I put this slide in here just so you could see the children, and you can see that, you know, she's had 9 children. And in fact, what I kind of like about this is that at least the youngest one was alive until 1944, was when the last of Victoria's children died. And another little sort of weird little fact is I was doing some research for some future presentations on the grandchildren of Victoria. Her last grandchild only died in 1981. So 1981 was the last grandchild. And that particular grandchild was born, I think she was 18 when Victoria died. So as an 18-year-old woman, she knew Victoria really well. And I believe she was like 98 when she died. So I just found that kind of interesting that, you know, even though Victoria's been gone for, you know, well over 100 years now, her grandchildren were still around in the 70s. And as I say, the last one died in 1981. Well, anyway, this whole issue of these 9 children, oh, sorry, one other thing. Sorry, before I get to that. Just so that we're clear about what we're talking about. Yeah, can we go to the one on royal residences? Because I'm going to mention all of these different places just so you have a sense of where I'm talking about. So clearly most of the action is going to take place in London. The 2 places, Buckingham Palace and Windsor. Windsor, we discussed before, the royal family is named after Windsor Castle. It's the big castle on the western edge of London. But I want to talk about Buckingham Palace because it's the main palace, most of you know. It's in central London. It was built in 1703, became a royal palace in 1761. In fact, George III bought it. If you've ever been to London and you've driven around it, I mean, this thing is humongous. I mean, humongous doesn't do justice to the size of Buckingham Palace. It has 775 rooms. 775 rooms. There are 19 staterooms, which are huge sized rooms, spaces for entertaining. 52 royal and guest bedrooms, 188 staff bedrooms, 92 offices and 78 bathrooms. I mean, the thing is huge. So this is where Victoria is going to do that role of being head of the executive branch. This is often where she's going to read dispatches from government ministers. She's going to meet her prime minister regularly. She's going to meet other ministers. She also, when a bill is passed by both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, she also has to sign it too. She has to give her assent. And under the system as it exists then and now, British monarchs, in theory, could refuse to give assent. But of course, that hasn't happened for a long, long time. Certainly Victoria always signed what was put in front of her. Her favorite residence are certainly somewhere that she enjoyed much more than Buckingham Palace. Buckingham Palace is sort of like the office, if you want to think of it that way, pretty fancy office though, is Windsor Castle. This is where Albert's going to die. This is where she's actually going to spend her weekends. Oftentimes with the advent of railroads and railways, she will almost begin this pattern of commuting into central London and carry out the business of government at Buckingham Palace and then return later in the day to Windsor, particularly once the children are grown up. That's sort of how she's going to live out a typical day. Windsor Castle, much older. It's built in 1066. Albert's going to die there. And she's actually going to be buried there too. She's got her own little mausoleum, which we will talk more about next week. And then I suppose her favorite place is Osborne House, which you can see way in the south. It's actually on the Isle of Wight. It doesn't look like it's a separate little island, but it actually is. It's the Isle of Wight. Albert bought the land, and he actually had built a sort of an Italianate style villa there. He had that built in 1845. Victoria's going to die there. She's going to die there in 1901. And then the only other place I should mention today, by the way, before I get to Balmoral, Osborne House isn't held currently by the royal family. When Victoria died, Edward VII, who inherited the crown from his mother, he didn't particularly like Osborne House for reasons I'll get into. And so you can visit the place, but it's not a royal residence. And the final place I want to mention is Balmoral, which still is a royal residence. It's held privately by the royal family, and it's going to be purchased in 1852. And again, it's purchased, one, because it reminds Albert of Germany, and two, because of the advent of technology. Victoria and Albert could actually get there. You know, before train technology came along, there was simply no way that you could purchase property in Scotland and hope to ever get there from London. But obviously now, with the advent of trains, Albert and Victoria take to essentially spending a large part of the summer. Once Parliament goes into recess, Victoria doesn't need to be at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. She can travel north to Balmoral, and that's essentially what she's going to do. She's going to summer in Scotland. Okay, next slide. Yes.
We have a question from Michelle.
Yeah.
She's asking, why was there a continual pressure to be overruled by her family members?
Why was she under pressure to be overruled by her family members? Was Michelle?
That's correct. Yes.
Michelle, were you thinking of someone in particular who overruled Victoria, or she's overruling them?
Her mother.
Well, her mother did until Victoria became queen, and then Victoria gets to call the shots. But essentially, once Victoria becomes queen, I mean, she's the one who's doing more of the overruling. She's the one who sort of sets the tone and sets the rules. And this is going to be something that we see again and again in Victoria's life. In terms of her family, in terms of the people who work directly with her, the courtiers, the lords and the ladies. I'm not talking about the serving class. I'm talking about the people who live above stairs, not the people who live below stairs. I mean, Victoria is a very, very difficult woman to live and work with because she, likes to get her own way and often does get her own way. The only group of people to whom she can't sort of bend her will are her prime ministers. I mean, they have their own ideas, and she will try to influence them. But essentially, as I say, if a prime minister wants to go in one direction and Victoria wants to go in another, tough. The prime minister's going to win. But in terms of how she manages her family, she manages them. She keeps them on a very short leash, which actually leads very nicely, if that answered the question, I hope, into Victoria's character and her sort of characteristics. And I guess I'll address that question again just by restating that Victoria never really learned to accept authority. And even when she lived with her mother, I mean, she and her mother fought constantly until she became queen. And then she could establish a system that she wanted that benefited her because she always saw herself as the authority. And she absolutely refused to allow anybody, even initially Albert, to encroach on any of her royal authorities. But, after having 9 children, even she comes to accept that, she needs help with this job of being a monarch. And so, of course, she realizes too that, Albert is extremely intelligent. She doesn't really have any of that formal policy education that he has. And so she does learn to accept that he can have some input in terms of how she behaves as a monarch and the things that she does. But in terms of Victoria as a woman, Victoria as a mother, I mean, this woman really rules the roost. A couple of other little things, if we were ever to sort of meet Victoria and I was going to give you a list of sort of do's and don'ts, she really dislikes smoking, which perhaps most of us would agree with. Some little stories about smoking. Her son, Bertie, who seems to like to do the very opposite of what she does. So whatever, if she likes X, then he's always going to like Y. So his mother doesn't like smoking, so Bertie smokes. She refuses to allow Bertie to smoke in any of her palaces. And in fact, she suspects that he is sneaking around her palaces in order to get a sly cigarette when she doesn't notice. So she leaves very firm instructions that even the conservatory, which is sort of like a sunroom, I guess, the English call it conservatory, it has to be locked at all times because she fears that her son will smoke in it. And so if you know anything about English weather, you know, you sort of do need a space inside, you know, if you're going to smoke, because it rains so much, you know, it's difficult to smoke. She dislikes gambling, which again is something that Bertie does. She does like animals, and that sort of comes across a little bit in the show. If you've seen the PBS show, she has a little King Charles Spaniel whose name is Dash. She also has collies, and in her mind, at least, she associates those with Scotland. She likes the Dachshunds, which she associates with Germany, and also Pomeranians at the end of her life. And I guess for Victoria, of course, animals provide sort of that unconditional love. But I was also surprised, just a slight side note into Albert, even Albert kept a finch in his dressing room, which I thought was kind of interesting. She gets very attached to people. She has very, very strong attachments to people. We'll talk more next week about John Brown. Some of you know about him. And after Albert dies, he is a Scottish manser.
You're freezing.
And sort of called her this old hag and said she was crazy, stupid intriguer with a thirst for power. But Victoria kept her, you know. Later on, you know, Albert is successful in sort of getting her removed. But for a long time, you know, she stays around. She, you know, until Albert finally gets to sort of enough input that he can get rid of her. And I want to make this point, I sort of already started to say it, that working for Victoria versus working with Victoria is very different experience. You know, if you're working with her as a member of her family, as a courtier, as somebody above stairs, you know, she's going to make your life difficult. But for the serving class, for the people who actually cook her meals or wash her clothes or fix her hair, or clean her palaces, you're actually going to like her. She is going to, at least at this point in her life, later on things change a little bit, but at this point in her life, she's going to know your name probably. She's going to remember, you know, whether or not, you know, your mother's sick, or she's going to remember, you know, which part of London maybe you live in, you know, unless you're living, you know, at the palace. I mean, she's going to know personal information about you. The mood swings we've mentioned briefly, you know, we talked about the porphyria. There's always this great fear that she's inherited something from her English, German relatives. And everybody is very aware that this woman's mood, you know, can turn on a dime. You know, you say the wrong thing, you know, you refer to things that she doesn't want referred to. I mean, she will let you know. I mean, if she is not above even earlier on in her marriage, like throwing things at Albert, you know, when she gets really, really angry with him. And then the other thing, which I don't know that I can relate to, well, at least one piece of it is the weather. She likes bad weather. I mean, everybody in England that I know complains about the weather, including myself. I mean, I'm in Florida right now, and I'm here essentially because, you know, we love the weather. I love the weather. But Victoria is somebody who finds that she likes to have windows open. She likes to have windows open year round. She likes to have windows open when it's snowing outside, or there's rain, or there's wind. She essentially believes, she says, she'll tell her doctor that, you know, she feels that, you know, there's benefits to having fresh, cold air, and she doesn't like overheating. She doesn't like rooms to have fires on, you know, even in winter when it's cold. And in fact, later on in her life, she will sort of let the people, her servants know that she doesn't want rooms to be heated anywhere close to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's sort of her absolute maximum temperature. She will be furious if she finds out that a room has been heated beyond that sort of, beyond that temperature. And so people know that, you know, when they come to the royal palace, you dress warmly, you know, even in the summertime, you know, you are not going to get, you know, it is going to be chilly in there. Okay, next slide.
Andrew, we have two questions.
Sure, go ahead.
The first is from Barry.
Yeah.
In the Victoria TV series, she had a close relationship with Lord Melbourne. Was
Yes.
that accurate?
I got. Is that true?
What was the question? What was the end of
I
the
didn't
question?
hear the end of the question. Sorry.
Was that accurate?
Was that
Yes,
accurate?
yes, she did. He was her first prime minister, and yes, yes, he did. Yes, they did have a close relationship. I think in the PBS show they implied there was a little bit more of a relationship. I don't feel that she crossed over any boundaries in terms of her relationship, or did anything that could be, considered improper. But yes, she liked him. She trusted him. She almost saw him as a father figure. She didn't have a father figure. She knew she was taking on this huge responsibility as a monarch. She's an 18-year-old girl, essentially. And here she is, having to read and respond to, these government documents coming in every week. So she welcomed his input. In fact, she got herself into a little bit of trouble. The best way I can explain this is that I believe in the early 1840s, Melbourne had to leave. Melbourne was a Liberal, and he lost the general election. And so a new prime minister came in. Now, when you had a new prime minister come in, not only obviously did you have the new prime minister, and the new prime minister was a conservative, but the leading ladies of the court, her ladies in waiting, also had to be from the same political party. Well, she did not want to lose the ladies in waiting that she had with Lord Melbourne. These were liberal women. She didn't want to lose them. So she refused to allow them to leave. And it caused a huge scandal because the incoming Tory conservative prime minister wanted the conservative women to be the ladies in waiting. And Victoria put her foot down and said no. Well, essentially, she had to give in. She lost ground on that one. But yes, no, he was a huge influence. Second question.
Have another question from Pat. Did she like luxury? Did she create?
Oh yes, no, she loved it.
Herself or more laid back?
Did she? Sorry, the second part.
Did she create structure for herself or more laid back?
No, she does. Initially, that's where Albert comes in. He will help provide that structure. But no, she loves luxury. She's more than happy to spend money. I love the story of when she buys Balmoral and with Albert. One of the first things she does is she runs off and she finds out there's a whiskey distillery nearby, and she basically loads up on scotch because this is a woman that likes scotch, and they've got great scotch up there. Whatever she was drinking in London, I guess didn't compare to the good stuff that she could get in Scotland. So, oh yes, she was more than happy. And you'll see that again when we see the mausoleum. This mausoleum is sort of like a mini church. It's a beautiful, beautiful structure. And so, yes, she does love luxury. She does welcome structure. And in fact, Albert will build structure into the day. And I'll talk in a moment about a typical day for Victoria and Albert. Okay, so let's get to one of the first myths about Victoria. So if you think about that statue I showed you at the beginning, she looks very prim and very proper, and very sort of cold and distant. And this is a woman, when we read about her, I did research into her, this is a woman who has a very strong interest in the physical side of her relationship. In her journal, and I'll talk more about her journals, but in her journal, she called her wedding night bliss beyond belief. She really, really had a wonderful experience. She had 9 children. And contraceptives, are available, but, respectable couples don't use them. Nevertheless, she hated having childbirth and having all these children. And even though she didn't have particularly bad pregnancies, she doesn't record having morning sicknesses or any particular problems. But one of the issues we have with knowing exactly what was happening in terms of childbirth, in terms of the physical side of her marriage, is that her diaries were very heavily edited when she died. And so essentially we're left with only about a third of what she wrote. So she may have actually described in greater detail some of the problems that she had with childbirth. But of course, we don't know that now because that information was destroyed by her daughter. She gives basically literally custody of her journals to her daughter, and 2/3 of those journals are gone. However, this whole issue of Victoria and all these babies sort of took me down my own little rabbit hole, because I wanted to know a little bit more about Victorian women and what they experienced. And after all, Victoria had 9 children. So how did that compare to what, let's call an average Victorian woman? Well, did a little bit of research, and essentially the average Victorian woman had 8 pregnancies, 8, and 5 resulted in living children. So Victoria had 9, all survived, probably not surprising. And something that sort of improved things considerably for the average Victorian woman is that in 1842, doctors started to clean their hands regularly before examining new mothers. The mortality rate for women in childbirth, the mortality rate dropped from 18 to 6%. I was just astounded by that. Mortality rate dropped from 18 to 6%. Another piece was Victoria is a woman who's not frightened of new technology. We talked about railways. I'll talk a little bit later on about photography. Victoria, in 1853, used chloroform as a sedative in childbirth. And she's going to use it for the first time for her 8th child very successfully. Next slide, please, is generally I mentioned she had good health, doesn't complain about morning sickness as best we can know because the diaries were so heavily edited. She does refuse to breastfeed. She considers that it's damaging to the intellectual refinement of young women, so she refuses to breastfeed. And we have a question. You have a question, Conrad?
Yes, we do. From Kaylee. Since her childhood was unhappy, was she therefore an attentive mother and loving?
No, she wasn't. I'll come more about no. We'll see, once these children come along, it's really Albert that provides the structure, the stability there, not her. No, she's not. She doesn't like having the children, although she has 9 of them. And she also doesn't seem to have liked them much when they were younger. As they get older, she develops stronger relationships with her children, but no. Childbirth, no, and the early years, no. She does not have particularly good relationships with her children. So she doesn't have breastfeeding. She doesn't allow her. She won't breastfeed her children. And something that I'm sure some of you will know this. I think it was also in the PBS show as well. Is that at that time in the mid-19th century, because she's a monarch, because she's producing heirs to the throne, right? These children, particularly the first couple, well, all of them, in fact, but they are required. There's a law in England at this time that when an heir to the throne is born, it doesn't have to be the heir, it doesn't have to be number 1 or number 2, but when an heir to the throne, somebody in the line of succession is born, that there has to be actual physical verification of that birth by a government minister in the room where the childbirth is taking place, so that that child can be verified that he or she is the actual child that came from the mother. Victoria will put her foot down over that rule. She will allow a government minister to be in the next room, but she will not allow anybody to actually be in the room with her while she's giving birth. And interestingly as well, Albert will be there. He will always be with her when her children are born. And just a little side note about the wet nurses. I did a little bit of research about them. Victoria, obviously, she used wet nurses, and she actually paid pretty well. The first one that she used, she paid that woman about 1,000 British pounds, which I believe is equivalent to about $75,000 in today's money. And a woman that she used for the second one, I didn't find how much she was paid, but I believe she was paid well. a woman called Mrs. Brough. She was the wet nurse to Bertie, her second child, and also her heir, her first male child. So Mrs. Brough, the wet nurse to Bertie, this woman essentially later on had a fit of madness and murdered her own 6 children, which I thought was kind of interesting. Well, anyway, essentially, once Victoria's had these children, and even though she's not particularly religious, this is not some kind of religious thing on Victoria's part, it's essentially an expectation of mid-19th century upper-class women, elite or royal women. Victoria was required to be churched after childbirth. And I didn't even know that there was an Anglican rite for this, but I gave this presentation in North Carolina, and somebody actually showed me where the rite exists. So she had to be churched. It was a ceremony that would allow her to come back into court life. Essentially, it took place, the churching ceremony took place about 40 days after the birth. Victoria was expected to wear a modest dress, a veil, and something that, obviously this didn't apply to Victoria because she had 9 healthy children, but I was a little bit saddened to read that you were still required to have the churching ceremony even if you had a stillbirth. So I couldn't imagine the pain of a woman who lost a child and still had to go through this, stillbirth, still got to go through this churching ceremony. Okay, so moving on. Let's talk about her as a mother, which reaches back to a question that we had a couple of minutes ago. So Albert's the one who likes to play with the children more, not Victoria. Victoria's got to limit seeing her children to essentially twice a day. She'll see them oftentimes around noontime, and they're sort of paraded in and sort of more like performing pets. You know, they'll sort of show the mother something that they've learned. It might be that they've learned something in French or something in German or something that they've done in the schoolroom, and then they'll show it, or a dance or some kind of something that they've learned, and they'll show it. So they'll see their mother around noontime, and they'll also see her mother just before they go to bed, but while she's dressing for dinner. So usually twice a day. The family will often speak German to each other. In fact, this also continues even after Victoria's gone. Doing a bit of research about Bertie, her heir, often the family, when they want to discuss something that they don't want the servants to hear, they will speak in German again to each other because obviously, most servants probably wouldn't speak German. But nevertheless, the first child is Vicky. She's a little bit of a wunderkind. She's extremely bright, extremely precocious. Apparently she began French at 18. Not sure that's true, but she loved to perform for her mother. Bertie, number 2, not so bright, had lots of difficulties in the schoolroom, and so he has a harder time trying to impress his mother. Each of the children, at least the first couple of children, they're all given certain nicknames. Vicky's called Pussy. The Prince of Wales is Bertie, we mentioned. Princess Alice was called Fatima, I don't know why. And Princess Helena was called Lenchen. Again, don't know why they gave those names, but those are the names. So, as a couple, Victoria, what was she like? Well, interestingly, even though we remember she was the one that proposed to Albert, she refused to delete the word obey from her marriage vows. So she didn't, she did promise to obey. Initially, as I mentioned, she's very sensitive to anyone, including Albert, encroaching on her royal duties. But again, with 9 kids, 9 pregnancies, Albert's going to become indispensable. And of course, later on, she comes to realize that Albert is essential for her to perform this role of government. The English have this system called government boxes. Today, they're red boxes. And essentially, anything can go into those red boxes, any aspect of government policy, any program that's being worked on, information about wars, information about the colonies would go into these red boxes, and Victoria would read them. And Albert's the one who really teaches her that, this is an art that you have to keep on top of your boxes. Not just read them and say, well, I read them, but actually understand them and process them and ask questions. And then if the questions don't come back in a timely manner, send up follow-up questions, right? And sort of really take your government ministers to task if they're not performing their duties, because the government minister is heading a department, and he is expected to be on top of that, and she's expected to be on top of those government ministers. So she takes that really, really seriously. Initially, it's going to cause tension in the marriage, but later on, as I mentioned, Victoria begins to realize that Albert is essential. One little piece of information. I mentioned that they build Osborne House in the Isle of Wight, and Victoria, always interested in who takes precedence. She will have a double door built, so that when she meets government ministers at Osborne House, the two of them could walk in at the same time. Instead of Albert walking in behind her, Albert can enter the room at the same time as Victoria enters the room, so that, there they are with the government minister entering the room at the same time. I know it all sounds kind of silly and trivial, to 21st century listeners, but, that's the 19th century world. Okay, next slide. Okay, any bad habits? Well, a couple. She liked erotic art, and here's an example of one of her favorite pictures. This is a statue of Lady Godiva, and the art includes a statue of Lady Godiva and a fresco entitled Neptune Resigning to Britannia, the Empire of the Sea. She also apparently used cannabis for menstrual cramps, and we believe that she put it in tea, or made some kind of tincture and put it in tea. There's also evidence that she tried a Bordeaux wine, a red wine, which was infused with coca leaves. And at this particular time, I know that, we think about coca leaves, and of course, it's easy to be very judgmental, but, in the 19th century, there's some estimates show that, I don't know about what ordinary Britons were doing, but certainly among elite Britons, it's possible that up to 10% of elite Britons were using things like laudanum, which has opium. People like George Eliot were using it, Charles Dickens and Bronte. It wasn't regulated, and I'm not sure that they fully understood, its addictive nature, but there you go, it was there. Next slide, please. So I guess in terms of the good habits, if we want to go down that road, over on the right, you can see Victoria loved art. She's someone who loved watercolor, engravings, etchings. And over on the right, we can see a painting, a watercolor, I believe. I know it's not terribly clear, but this is of Vicky. She's probably less than 2. She liked to draw her first child. That's the precocious Wunderkind 1, who apparently could speak French at 18. Her second child, Albert, I kind of like this. She told him, I'm sure parents out there, nobody would ever say this to a child or a grandchild, but she did. She told him, told Albert that she didn't like to paint him because he had knock knees and a misshapen nose. But apparently Vicky was a very, paintable child. Later on, she's going to become interested in photography, which is a great benefit to me because I can find all these photographs of Victoria. And, again, someone who just loved technology and loved using it in all its different ways. And finally, she liked, and I'm going to put this under good habits, she liked dancing. This is a woman who liked to have drink. She likes scotch after dinner. Albert doesn't drink so much. She's happy to sing some scotches. I don't think she was a drunk. I'm sure she could, hold her booze, but she liked to have a couple of glasses of scotch, dance a couple of reels, go to bed. Albert's going to be in bed 9, 10 o'clock. Victoria's going to keep going until, at least 11 o'clock. So I kind of like that about her. Here's one of my favorite slides just because of the information. I don't know whether we'll call this good or bad, but I certainly enjoyed doing the research here. So Victoria, like, what would she be like, I guess, if we met her, if we got invited to dinner, and what would we see? What would we experience? Well, we mentioned that she likes scotch. She's got to drink it in her tea. She's got to put it in red wine. Albert is not a big drinker. And I mentioned, of course, that when she bought a property, Balmoral, she's going to order lots of scotch, and she's actually going to have it shipped down to London. She's going to enjoy it in Scotland too, but have it shipped down to London. But essentially, after we've got past the fact that here's a woman that likes scotch, now we're sitting down to our meal, right? We're going to sit down and eat. And essentially, what are we going to see? Well, some of you probably imagine that Victoria, you know, is going to be sort of like the stereotype of the English. You know, she's going to hold a knife and fork correctly. She's going to eat very primly. You know, she's not going to bang her silverware against the soup bowl or the plate or whatever. You know, you're not going to see the food in her mouth getting chewed. Well, nothing could be farther from the truth. You know, this is a woman who loves food. And she likes food so much that, number one, she likes to eat a lot of it, and she likes to eat it quickly. So essentially, what you're going to experience is that when you go to Windsor Castle for dinner, this woman is going to get through about 6 or 7 courses in about 30 minutes, which means that, you know, if she's eating, let's say, a pork chop, she's going to pick it up. She's going to get the juice all over her mouth. The juice is going to run down her fingers, and she's going to eat that thing fast, right? Now, you might be thinking, oh, that's interesting. I didn't think that, you know, Victoria would have pork chop juice sort of all down her mouth and all over her fingers and possibly on her clothes as well. But you probably wouldn't be thinking that at that particular point, because as some of you may know, when Victoria finishes a course, remember, she's eating quickly. It also means that you finished a course too, because essentially when her plate gets taken away because she's finished with it, so is yours. Even if you're not done, you are done. And this becomes a constant complaint of people who get invited to the royal palace, that they never get time to actually eat any food because Victoria is eating her food so quickly. She's not talking to anybody. She's not making small talk. She's not doing anything else other than eating this food. So what did she like? She has a very sweet tooth. She likes tarts. She likes cakes. She likes profiteroles. She likes buttered toast. Any of those. Albert liked rice pudding. Actually, I like rice pudding too. And so, yeah, I mean, this was the most surprising bit of information about this woman who, you know, when you think of that statue, you would never imagine that statue with, like, you know, sort of the remains of food around the mouth and all dripping down the side and, you know, over the fingers. You know, it could not be, you know, 360 degrees polar opposite of how we imagine Victoria. Next slide, please. So then I got into, you know, as you can imagine, eating all that food over time, Victoria is going to gain weight. And what I like particularly about what I found out about this was I did a little bit of research into Victoria's weight. And I actually found out more actually about how Victoria treated her servants, which is that when undergarments could no longer be reused, it seems that she gave them to her staff, her servants, not her courtiers, but to her personal servants, the women who took care of her, who bathed her, who washed her clothes, who fixed her hair. She gave them her used undergarments. And apparently what seems to have happened is that these women kept these undergarments, kept them sort of preserved, and so that even today, if you click on the last piece, you can find these undergarments for sale. One of them sold recently for $18,000, and they've got the little VR on them to show the little, everything obviously had its own little labeling VR on each of the garments. And of course, the garments also give you a sense of the size of Victoria. These are probably from later on in her life, but they do speak to the fact that this is a woman who, truly, truly loves her food. Okay, so I'm going to reach back to an earlier question that somebody asked about a day, just to sort of fill that in a little bit more. So, typical day, Victoria likes to breakfast around 9. And breakfast in England isn't this big, elaborate affair with servants bringing things up to you. Essentially, the English do it sort of buffet style. They'll serve breakfast foods on a buffet table, and you just go back and help yourself. And so she'll eat about 9 o'clock. Breakfast will be for about an hour or so. She'll take a short walk in the gardens at Buckingham Palace. And then she and Albert will work. This is the time he's set aside. So they'll work from about 10:30 to about noon. Children are coming in around noontime for their visit. So they're all sort of spruced up and cleaned and sort of told what they've got to present. And then she'll have lunch about 2. And then there'll be some more government work. So back to those dispatch boxes. And this is Albert that does this routine. Sort of a couple of hours in the morning to work on government work, a couple of hours in the afternoon. 5 p.m. she always liked to go out for a carriage ride. Or, if the weather was really bad, or even if the weather was bad, I don't think it really bothered her. Albert would then like to read to her. He would read to her. She really liked Tennyson. She liked the novels of Charles Dickens. So he would read to her. Evening meal was always at 8. And then afterwards, Albert would retire. And, she liked to party. She'd have a few more drinks. If there was dancing, she would have dancing. Sometimes her ladies in waiting were expected to be able to sing or play the piano and sing. And she really enjoyed that. And so she's going to get to bed close to midnight, and sort of then the new day starts. So let's look at her journals, because I mentioned those earlier on. Remember, we talked about, I wanted to explore sort of more of the physical side of her life. And one of the obstacles I faced was that her original journals were basically purged, so that, they went down from, 2/3 of them essentially purged. So we have the original. Now, this particular one survived. I believe somebody copied it somehow. It's not clear to me how it survived, but I understand that what you're seeing on the left is an original, and then the purged version. And the purged version essentially evolved when Victoria died. Her daughter went through her mother's journals page by page, and she essentially just wrote out what the daughter wanted to be retained, and then burned page by page every, the journal. And so you can see what we've got here. So Rita's gone ahead and just highlighted on sort of the key points here, put stockings on for me, saw him shave, then went out for a pony ride, and then you sort of get the purge version. This is what the daughter wrote, Beatrice, the daughter, wrote on the right. Okay, we got a question.
Yes, from Michelle. What was Queen Victoria's most impressive or important contribution as a public servant?
As a public servant, I think her most impressive contribution was the fact that she really took seriously the role of being a monarch. That she understood through Albert that it was something that had to be done. Her uncles had never really taken it seriously. They didn't read through government documents. They weren't informed. They didn't bother to ask questions. They just simply assumed that the government ministers would take care of, whatever needed to be taken care of. But she saw it differently. Now, I'll say sadly, she didn't train her son to do that. She didn't want him involved. When she dies, her son has to do some very fast learning on the job, because he never really was able to work alongside his mother so that he could have the training to do that job. But essentially, seeing this role as being important, being valuable, and something that needed to be taken seriously. This woman is not a Democrat. You know, she's not arguing for the extension of the vote. She doesn't support that. She doesn't even support suffrage for women. She does not want women to have the vote. In fact, she says that women who support suffrage, women who support suffrage, in her words, should be horsewhipped, because she does not believe that women are capable of voting, which, you know, for a woman to say that about other women, I know is bizarre, but this is what she believes. So we're not talking about this woman as a liberal. We're not talking about this woman as a reformer. This woman didn't understand really that Britain is industrializing, that Britain is urbanizing. She doesn't understand about trade union movements. She doesn't understand about home rule for Ireland. And yet, having said all that, I do believe that by seeing this role of monarch as being super important, she really takes it seriously. Okay, great question. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about how English was Victoria. Okay, so first little myth I want to sort of get rid of right away. Victoria does not speak English with a German accent. Okay, she can speak German fluently, but she never speaks it with a German accent. Okay, essentially, she says, even as young as 4, it's reported, her mother says that as young as 4, right? Her mother is German. Remember, her mother and Albert's father are siblings. And so her mother reports at age 4, Victoria told the mother that she only wanted to speak English at home. Because remember, English is not the mother's first language, it's German, right? So, and the father's dead, so there's only just this relationship with the mother. And this is Baroness Lazen, who's also German. So Victoria is putting her foot down, even at the age of 4, and saying, I want to speak English, okay? She identifies very closely with her English ancestors. And for those of you, some of you will know this already, but before Victoria's immediate English ancestors, the House of Hanover was the House of Stuart. And essentially they were kicked out for reasons I don't want to go into, but they were kicked out because they were Catholic, and they were called the Jacobites. And Victoria identifies with them. And I didn't say this much at the beginning, I should have done, but I really like Victoria because she's extremely strong sense of herself. She's a very independent-minded woman. She knows what she wants, and she's not frightened to, you know, voice opinions that might be at odds with what many of our subjects think and feel. And she doesn't share the widespread xenophobia of her English subjects. You know, she took a German husband. Well, in one sense, you know, she had to. Well, she had to marry somebody who was royal. There were no English royals that she could marry because, you know, there were no, at this point, there were no issues, clearly there were no issues about marrying first cousins because she did marry a first cousin. But if any of her father had any of her father's siblings had children, male children, then she could have married them, but there weren't any. You know, there was Victoria, there was that other first cousin who died. So essentially, she's limited, she has to look to non-English royals. And the only other prescription is that they need to be Protestant, right? Because under the Act of Succession, you have to marry A, a royal, and B, that person needs to be a Protestant. So yes, Victoria is limited, but nevertheless, she took a German husband. She's going to have an Indian manservant. We'll talk about him next week, Abdul Karim. And I like this other little story. You're seeing an image of a woman called Sarah Forbes Bonetta. She was a freed slave. She was actually in the Caribbean. She was bought by an Englishman. She was brought to Britain in 1849. Victoria wanted to meet her. They met at Windsor Castle. And in fact, Sarah Bonetta and Victoria actually became, well, quite close friends. Victoria agreed to pay for Sarah's education. And actually, Victoria also agreed to be the godmother of this woman's child, which I think really speaks well about Victoria's tolerance as a woman. Next slide. We're already getting a sense of this, of what she was like. She really likes being queen. She's not so crazy about being a mother. She does love being Albert's wife. She is, they do have a very strong relationship. Initially, she doesn't like Albert interfering, but once she realizes how important he is to helping her being monarch, and at the same time, their marriage blossoms and it becomes one of true mutual dependence. She enjoys being a wife. But I want to come back to an earlier point I made about why I like Victoria, even though there are things not to like about her. This is a woman who knows herself. So there's one of my favorite quotes from Charlotte Bronte, who actually saw Victoria once at an embassy in Brussels. So Victoria was there. She was laughing, and this is a quote from Charlotte Bronte. She said, Charlotte said, Victoria was laughing and talking very gaily. She looked a little stout, well, not surprising, little stout, vivacious lady, plainly dressed, not much dignity or pretension. So this is not a woman who is going to put on airs for you. She's not going to look down on you. She knows who she is, and she doesn't need to look down on you. She already knows, what she is. She likes entertainment. A funny little story. In 1837, there was a famous lion tamer, Isaac van Amber. She went to see him 6 times at Drury Lane, which is in the West End. And I've also mentioned as well that she loved to have her ladies in waiting sing and play the piano, and they were all expected to read sight music. If you couldn't read sight music, Victoria was not interested in you. So let's go to policy views.
And we have a question from Michelle.
Yes, go ahead.
Any evidence of DNA bloodline issues in her children due to marrying her first cousin?
Say that again?
Any evidence of DNA bloodline issues?
No, not that I'm aware of. The only issue that we've talked about is the hemophilia. But that's not, you're talking about the fact that she married her first cousin. No, not that I'm aware of, no. So in terms of her policy views, I've already mentioned she doesn't believe in votes for women, even though one of her daughters does. Princess Alice supports the suffragette cause. She had some definite views about other topics. If you remember, she's getting government briefings every week. And in the late 1880s, 1889, Jack the Ripper, some of you will know, he's the serial killer in the East End of London. And of course, it's splashed all over the tabloids in London, in fact, all over the world, I'm sure. She, after reading all the government documents, because she was very interested in this topic, everybody wanted to, catch the man, but everybody wanted to, of course, know who he was. And she writes to the Home Secretary, who is the minister in charge of internal affairs, police, internal security, the courts, and so on. She will write to the Home Secretary in 1889. She will give the Home Secretary advice. She said she wanted all the seamen's hostels. So London is also a port city, and of course sailors have to stay somewhere when their ship is in port. And she was convinced it was a sailor coming in from one of these ships in the East End of London. She wanted them all searched so that, they could look for bloody clothing. I'm sure the government did. It didn't work, but nevertheless, she wanted that done. She will support social causes, such as the silk weavers, and she will help to try and raise money for them. And she'll also help donate £2,000, $150,000 in today's money for Irish famine relief efforts. But she doesn't understand, the larger issue about home rule for Ireland, and she doesn't, agree with, men and women who are trying to organize themselves into trade union, but she is happy to donate money. She is willing to support people who've fallen on hard times because they can't work. Okay, next slide. Let's get to religion. We mentioned this briefly. Victoria is, she's head of the church, which means that she attends church regularly. That's a cultural expectation. She's not a woman who's particularly religious, certainly not overtly religious. She's not going to be phony. She's not going to pretend to be religious because you would expect it. She generally, the royal family will celebrate Christmas, of course, because it's a cultural, well, it's been a religious event, it's also a cultural event. And she'll spend it at Windsor. She also has some interesting beliefs in what are called spiritism. There's something much later in, if you can just click through. Okay. Okay, I'll come to that later. So we talk about Christmas trees, and she's somebody who popularizes what are called yew trees in the 1840s, although I think her grandmother, Queen Charlotte, probably was the one who first brought yew trees to England as part of the Christmas celebrations. They will decorate the trees with gingerbread. They will light candles. The children were encouraged to make gifts to decorate the trees. The children made the gifts. There was 9 kids. And then the gifts were donated to the local army barracks. So the same men who got the scarves later on got the gifts in the 1850s, which had been made by the children. But there's no sense of them giving these gifts. It wasn't commercial in the same way that Christmas has become today. Her children, as early as 1843, were also encouraged to make Christmas cards, which had become fashionable, and they would send them to their friends. And then I just put this up there. I thought there might be some Canadians out there, some English people out there. We also get what the English call Christmas crackers. I believe the American term is the cracker bonbons, which is a kind of a cute little English tradition where you pull them at the table and there's always some kind of little gag gift in there and you put on the silly little hat, and they were filled with trees. That also starts with Victoria too. So I just want to get into a side little story when doing all this research about Victoria. Was I came across this guy, he was called the Boy Jones, and he was a stalker, essentially. He stalked Victoria. His name was Edward Jones. He was obsessed with the Queen, and in fact, he actually broke in 3 times into her royal palace. At the first time, he was arrested at the age of 14. He broke into Buckingham Palace, disguised as a chimney sweep. He was actually captured with a pair of Victoria's undergarments down his trousers. And then later on in 1840, he was caught again under a sofa. He was caught under a sofa in the Queen's dressing room. Obviously, at this point, the royal palace was embarrassed that this 14-year-old boy had been caught twice in the royal palace, which doesn't really speak to sort of poor quality security within Buckingham Palace. So to limit the publicity, Jones was tried in secret. This boy, Edward Jones, was tried in secret and sentenced to 3 months for housebreaking. When he served his sentence and came out, he was offered £4 a week, which is pretty good money then. The average salary was close to £1 a week, so he was making 4 times the average salary. If he would appear in a music hall, in a stage, so that he could sing songs and act out, his life story at this point, I guess. He refuses to do so. He breaks it again a year later in 1841, is found sitting on the throne. He's sentenced to hard labor. They basically, to get him out of the country, he was press ganged. The British Navy at this time would essentially kidnap young men, force them to serve in the Navy. And so, it was a convenient way to get him out of the country. He turns up again in London, although he didn't get into Buckingham Palace this time. This time, though, because he turned up in London again, he was put in a prison hulk. Britain was running out of prison space, so they brought into service old Navy ships and essentially used them as prisons for 6 years, and then was transported to Australia, which is eventually where he died. He didn't actually come back to Britain. I mean, essentially, once you were transported to Australia, you were told that, if you showed up again in England, you would be executed. So he doesn't actually return to England, but he did actually settle down in Australia, and he became a town crier, which I thought was a kind of somebody who would sort of read the news to the town's inhabitants. Anyway, so we need to get to Albert. We haven't talked about him much because I've spent so much time on Victoria. Anyway, Albert, we know he's German, and his first sort of experience of Britain was not a particularly good one. he was slighted by the British government. He had expected to get 50,000 British pounds, which is probably several $million in today's money. He's expected to get 50,000 pounds. He only got 30 because the British government didn't want to give money to a German. He has a rather serious nature. One of the texts talks about Albert sounding like a harassed school teacher. He is going to be the guy, you know, if you meet him at a party, you know, Victoria's going to come over to you probably and talk to you and say something to you and be rather outwardly friendly, probably. Albert's going to be a little more standoffish. He's going to stand off to the side. He is probably not going to engage with you, you know, unless you go and engage with him. He's a lot more prudish than his wife. A little story I liked about him. Albert made it a point of learning about his guests before he invited them. So if he learned that guest X was having a relationship with guest Y, and guest X and guest Y are not married, then he made sure that guest X and guest Y were, in terms of where they were housed at night, where their guests were roomed for the night, he made sure that they were as far away as possible. Victoria didn't like extramarital affairs, but she certainly wasn't going to go to the trouble of making sure that people were, you know, as separate as they could possibly be. But Albert just simply didn't like that. Hated financial waste, worked hard to cut expenses at Buckingham Palace. In fact, did a pretty good job. He saved £25,000 on staff pensions and other arrangements. I mentioned that he attended all the births of his children, which was extremely unusual because that was against the royal tradition. And there's some suggestion that he rather enjoyed his wife's pregnancies because it gave him far more power to make decisions in terms of, you know, managing that, you know, sort of head of the executive piece. So Albert was, as I mentioned, he's the one that, you know, the children sort of went to. He was the sort of the go-to parent. In fact, interestingly, when Albert died, Victoria, you know, so Albert's just died, Victoria will run to the royal nursery and sit there until midnight because she sensed that the nursery was the one place where she could feel her husband's presence. So that sort of speaks to his role, you know, as being this concerned father. And in fact, the children later on would speak about that, you know, how they think about their father. When they think about him, they often thought about him, and it was often in the context of that nursery. But nevertheless, you know, even though Albert was a loving parent, he was a tough parent, you know. He expected his children to perform, to learn, to know. Vicky, the first child, incredibly bright, gifted. Albert, Bertie, the second child, not so great. And in fact, when Bertie, you know, if Bertie failed his lessons, and in fact, one particular year, Bertie was having a pretty poor semester at school because when I say at school, he was educated at Buckingham Palace. They had tutors come in to educate the children. If Bertie didn't perform up to expectations, then, and one semester he didn't, Albert essentially said, we're going to Balmoral, but I'm cancelling summer vacation for you. You're going to have to continue to be tutored over the summer because, you know, you didn't meet, you know, my expectations in terms of my goals for you. Next slide, please. So we need to get to Albert's death. So one other thing that I could mention about Albert is that standoffish, sort of a little bit introverted, and he's also a man who is rather fatalistic, perhaps a little depressive. He will visit Coburg in Germany for the last time in 1860, and he tells everybody when he goes on that visit that this is probably the last time I'm going to be here, you know. So he says, you know, or we find out later on that he, you know, felt that, you know, a year prior to his death, he felt that he was close to death. But, you know, outside his family, he doesn't have many friends. He's not particularly connected to the English elite. They don't like him. He doesn't like them. And so essentially, he's got this relationship with his wife, which is now a good one, which is a loving and supportive marriage. And he's got these, 9 relationships with his children. And that's essentially his world. Well, fast forward to November 1861. He develops essentially what he considers at first to be a gastric flu. It has a low fever. And at this point, nobody's concerned. He's got this cold. It'll probably pass in, a week or two. He's 42 years old. He's fairly healthy. He doesn't drink heavily. He doesn't smoke. He's physically active. And there's every reason to think that, this will pass and life will go on. However, we now know that he actually has typhoid. And typhoid is a waterborne illness, and essentially, if left untreated, it can kill you. And so at this point, it's November 1861. Albert's not feeling great, and Bertie, that son we've talked about, gets himself, unfortunately, into some trouble. He's been having a relationship with a young actress. Albert feels this young actress is probably a prostitute. Bertie, sick, travels from London to Cambridge. Bertie's at Cambridge now. He's an undergraduate at Cambridge because he wants to manage this so that because he fears that his son's going to be blackmailed by this actress prostitute. And so he wants to sort of get some management on top of it. And everybody says he's too sick to travel, but Albert goes anyway. And of course, he comes back from Cambridge. He's even worse. Instead of resting, now he's essentially, he has to be bedridden at this point. And in 1861, even though typhoid was diagnosed, doctors didn't know that, we obviously didn't have antibiotics, and nobody understood that, the best way to treat somebody with typhoid is to give them intravenous fluids, right? So that they stay hydrated. So that doesn't happen. And Albert's bedridden at this point. Around early December, he's got this rose-colored skin rash, okay, which apparently is the sign of typhoid. And he's got a fever, he's got abdominal pain, and there's bloody diarrhea, okay? Now, at this point, Victoria makes a critical mistake. She should have brought in professional nursing, right? She should have brought in professional women. Nursing at this point was only women. She should have brought in professional women to manage the situation, right? Instead, she relies on her third child, Vicky, who has an interest in nursing, but obviously it's a child. She's at this point 16 or 17. She's not professionally trained, and it's her father, right? And Albert is getting sicker and sicker. And at this point, he's also becoming delirious. He's disoriented, he's dehydrated. They can't even keep him in a room. Essentially, he's moving from room to room. He's making it worse. Vicky can't manage him. And I feel that if they'd have brought a nurse in, some kind of tough woman who could have managed Albert and sort of kept him in bed and stopped him wandering around, then perhaps, I don't know, he may well still have died, but at least somebody would have had a better management over his condition. However, typhoid is a particularly nasty illness. There were issues around his breathing. Albert's coughing a lot. His tongue was blackened and swollen, so he can't breathe properly anymore. And essentially, right up until the end, Victoria refuses to accept any kind of professional help. She relies on that daughter. But essentially, on December the 14th, Albert settles on the Blue Room, which is eventually where, if we got it in the next slide. Ah, yes, here it is. Okay, so here's the Blue Room. And I'll talk about the difference between the two pictures in a moment. So at 5:30 p.m., the bed, which in the picture at the top hasn't been wheeled into the center of the room, but will be wheeled into the center of the room. Victoria's on one side. At 5:30 p.m., Albert's going to say his final words, Gutes Frauchen, which means good little wife. He's going to die about 5 hours later at Windsor Castle. Sorry, the blue room is at Windsor Castle. Victoria's there, and he is 42 years old. One little thing I should just mention at this point is that daughter, Vicky, the one who's sort of the head nurse, she had Victoria, because she blamed her eldest son, Bertie, because Albert had gone to Cambridge to manage the situation with the actress prostitute, and it sickened him and he got worse. Victoria is blaming Bertie for her husband's illness, right? And Victoria refused to allow Bertie to be called back from Cambridge, but actually it's Alice who will call Bertie back to Windsor Castle so that he can be with his father. So you could already see the beginnings of, you know, a relationship between Victoria and her eldest son, which is going to be in every way as difficult as the relationship Victoria had with her mother. But nevertheless, there's a quote that Victoria, I won't read it to you, but it's the quote that Victoria wrote immediately after. Now, obviously the first picture is sort of an artist's rendition of what the room looked like. Now, what you're seeing underneath is how the room actually looked. And for the remainder of her life, Victoria had the room preserved as a mausoleum. The room where Albert died, every single day, you know, fresh clothes were brought out, fresh hot water, shaving materials, everything that Albert would have needed to start a new day was put out every single day for the remainder of her life. And you can see the bed that he died on. She had flowers put on the bed. Yeah, I mean, even there was a story about somebody had left a handkerchief on a sofa, just left a handkerchief by accident. She refused to allow to have the handkerchief removed because she wanted that room to be so perfectly preserved that nothing would ever change. And so it was. Next slide, please. Now, what we're looking at here is, this is actually a death photograph. We talked a little bit about photography. I guess somebody suggested to Victoria, given that she loved photography so much, that we should take a photograph of Albert. This was taken a few hours after he died. And you can see that, you know, they literally rushed to get the photographer in. The people around Albert are clearly in shock because you can see nobody's even bothered to fix the hair of Albert. It's exactly as it was when he died. And this particular photograph, she's going to keep it with her for the rest of her life. In fact, when she dies, she's also going to have a photograph taken. And also Bertie, that son, who she blames, he's also going to have a photograph taken. So a little bit of a tradition there. But anyway, Victoria, you know, not surprisingly, she's devastated. She's going to be sedated. We talked about the fact she blames Bertie, but she does get some consolation. She's telling everybody that her husband was not afraid of death. And so, next slide, please.